Number 1. Loner. I didn't have a lot of friends growing up. There were times when I would have someone to hang out with for a short period of time, but those friendships rarely lasted very long. More often than not, I ended up being alone. I didn't mind being alone, really. It was nice to have time to think, and I did that quite a lot. I used to go on really long walks simply to have time to think. While I didn't have many long-term friends, I did know a couple of bullies. And the absolute worst bully I ever knew was this guy named Billy. He was one of those childhood and eventually teenage thugs that you knew was going to end up in prison someday. He was always getting into fights. He was always getting suspended from school. And before he was 16 years old, he was expelled from school. This story, however, takes place before that happened. I was 13 years old at the time, and I think Billy was 15, and it happened on Halloween night of that year. Now, I had trick-or-treated the year before. I probably would have done so at 13 if I had friends to go with me. But I was feeling a bit weird about the whole idea. Still, I loved the atmosphere of trick-or-treating. I liked seeing all the people out there enjoying Halloween. So although I didn't dress up, and I didn't go house to house asking for candy, I actually did go out for a long walk in the neighborhood. In our neighborhood, tons and tons of children would be out trick-or-treating. People went all out in decorating their houses. Individual yards got turned into haunted houses. And parents dressed up to try and scare trick-or-treaters as they came up to their houses. This is why I was not able to just stay home on Halloween night. It was just way too fun. So I walked through the neighborhood, back and forth a few times. Seeing everyone having so much fun did sort of get me down after a little while. It made me feel that maybe it would have been okay one more time to go out trick-or-treating. But of course, by that point, it was too late to change my mind. As trick-or-treating wound down, I was feeling even more down than I had been before. So I decided I would keep walking. I walked out of the neighborhood, and I even walked out of town. I hadn't brought a watch with me, so I was never exactly sure how long I had been out, or what time it was. When you are depressed and walking around, you can lose track of time pretty quickly. At one point, I came across a cemetery that was out of town. Feeling that my Halloween had been a bit disappointing, I decided maybe a trip through the cemetery might cheer me up a bit. I could still end my Halloween with a spooky time. Have you ever been walking, and you come along a stray dog or a stray cat? And a lot of times, you do that, and the animal follows you around? It's usually a nice thing to happen. As I walked into the cemetery, a really big Rottweiler came trotting up toward me. At first, I froze out of fear. I mean, those dogs are huge, and I had no idea what to expect from it. I was pleasantly surprised, though, when the dog came up to me and nuzzled my hand. So I tried to be brave and pat the dog on the head. He was responsive, so I tried scratching his ears. He liked that too. So I decided that I had come across a friendly companion for my walk through the cemetery. I have to admit also that I was a bit happier to have the dog with me for my walk. Cemeteries are pretty scary, no matter what. The dog trotted right beside me as I walked through the graveyard. Even with him there, I have to admit to being a bit unnerved. But that's what I was looking for. It was quiet in the cemetery, and the small breezes of wind, making the trees rustle a bit, was eerie. However, I was only slightly unnerved about being there. The dog stayed with me throughout the entire walk through the cemetery. but when I got to the other side, to the exit, he only followed me for a short period of time afterward. The dog sat on the ground and looked at me. I stopped and gave his ears another scratch. I thanked him for coming along with me. He then turned and ran back toward the cemetery. I have to admit, I was a little disappointed at losing my companion, but I was happy for the experience. I started thinking maybe he wasn't a stray. Maybe he was a guard dog that belonged to whoever was the caretaker for the cemetery. If so, he was the nicest guard dog I had ever come across. One of the things that I didn't like about Halloween was that it often fell on a weekday, so I had school the next day. I had been out really late the previous night, so I was sort of sleepwalking through the day. During lunchtime, I was eating alone, and that was when someone came and seated themselves across from me at the table. I was shocked to see that it was Billy. I was scared, but also surprised. He wasn't the kind of guy to bully someone in the lunchroom, where he would easily be caught. "Enjoy your little walk through the graveyard?" he asked me. "You're so chicken shit that you had to take your dog with you? Well, you can't have him with you all the time, you little fag." And with that, Billy got up and left. I was stunned. It took me a little while to try and put two and two together. Once I did, I realized that he and his buddies must have been hanging out in the cemetery, and they saw me walking through the previous night. As his comments sunk in further, I realized that the only reason this sociopath hadn't attacked me was because of that huge Rottweiler that had followed me through the graveyard. I don't really know what to think about that. Did the graveyard have a guard dog? I had no way of knowing, and I was not going to go there or call there and ask. Was it a stray dog that just coincidentally came up upon me? I have no idea. But knowing how crazy and mean Billy was, if he had attacked me that night, who knows what would have happened to me? It wouldn't have been good. Number 2. The lights. Since it is the season now, I thought I would share a very scary experience that happened to me once on Halloween. It was a normal Halloween for the most part. I was a teenager at the time. I didn't do things like trick-or-treat anymore, but I did go over to my best friend's house in order to watch scary movies. This was in the late 1980s, so we didn't have access to as much horror content as you can get on the internet nowadays. All we could really have was a VCR, and my family didn't actually have a VCR, but my friend Alan's family did. So whenever they would make a trip to the video store, especially on Halloween, I would go over there, and we would just watch a bunch of scary movies. Alan didn't live very close to me. My parents had to drive me to his house. After watching the movies, I normally would have spent the night. This was because by the time we were done watching, my parents would have already gone to bed. Then, my parents would come and get me sometime the following day, but there had been a few occasions when I would have walked back to my own house from Alan's house. We had a pretty good time watching movies that night. I can still remember a few of the movies we had watched. Carrie, A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, and Prom Night. We started watching early, so we usually got through about 5 movies, but I don't remember what the others were. It was well past midnight by the time we were done watching the movies. And like normal, Alan had fallen asleep before we were done. I got through them all, though. I went to get ready for bed, and that was when I realized that I had forgotten to bring something with me that I absolutely needed if I was going to get any sleep. I always slept with earplugs in my ears, because the slightest sound would always wake me up. This might not seem like a big deal to most people, but it was a huge deal to me. Alan was one of those deep sleepers, and he wouldn't be up for like 8 hours. I wasn't prepared to not be able to sleep for that long, so I decided that I would just go ahead and head on home. It would take me about an hour to make the walk, but it would be worth it when I would actually be able to sleep. So I decided that I would go ahead and do that. I left Alan a note. He knew that I had to have the earplugs asleep, so he wouldn't be upset at me for leaving. Alan lived in the town next over from my own town. Both of these towns went to the same school system, which is how the two of us became friends. In order to get from one town to the next, I would have to walk out of town, and along this road by this forest on both sides. It was dark and very creepy, and I was not looking forward to doing it. I almost actually changed my mind. When I got to the forested part of the road, I could feel my heartbeat starting to beat much faster. I just had to remind myself that I had done this before. There was nothing to be scared of, and that very soon I would be at home and I would be in bed. Walking through that area, it was very dark. I could see a little bit, but not much. I had a light on my watch, but it was one of those LCD lights in a digital watch, and at the time, they barely even let you see the numbers on the watch, much less using it as a flashlight. Eventually, something caught my eye off to the right of me. Peering into the forest, I noticed what looked like some very faint lights. They were a bit away from me, but watching them, they looked like they were coming closer. They got closer as I watched, and I eventually was able to make out that there were 3 of them, and they were moving in my direction, really slowly. I have to admit, into believing in things like ghosts and UFOs and things like that. So seeing 3 lights moving toward me from a forest in the pitch black in the middle of the night, I lost my nerve. I began running as fast as I could. I ran and ran until I got all the way to the end of the forested part of the road, and then some. Finally I looked back. I didn't see anything behind me, so I turned and went back to walking home. I was walking a bit faster than I had been before I noticed the lights. I didn't quit until I got home. It was several days later when I heard the news that scared the hell out of me. A dead body of a young man in his early 20s was found buried in a shallow grave. The grave was in the woods, along that road I had been walking on that night on Halloween. It was in the middle of the forest. Later that day, 3 men were arrested in suspicion of the murder. One of them cracked during questioning and confessed to everything. Now, I have absolutely no way of knowing if those 3 lights that I had seen were flashlights from those 3 men making their way out of the forest after burying the man they had killed. But the timing seems perfect, doesn't it? The murder happened on Halloween that day, and the body was found in that area. Whether or not it was them is something I would never know, but I will always believe that it was. I ran away because I thought the lights I was seeing were ghosts. Honestly, if I had thought that they were 3 men with flashlights, I probably wouldn't have run. I wouldn't have thought that was something to be scared of. So if it was them, my believing in ghosts may have saved me from a similar ending. Number 3. The Bridge. Okay, I've told this story before to friends, and some of them have had their doubts about it. But I always take the story with a grain of salt. And that doesn't mean I want you to doubt that the story happened. It definitely did. But since it happened on Halloween, it is quite possible that it may have just been a prank. I really don't know whether or not it was a prank or it was serious. In the town I grew up in, we have a pretty big graveyard. And of course, when Halloween comes around, it turns into the center of teenage activity in the town. Groups of teenagers can always be found in different parts of the graveyard, drinking, smoking weed, sometimes having sex. Although honestly, the very idea of having sex in a graveyard is confusing to me. I struggle to think how anyone can find that arousing. Me and my two best friends were not too keen on hanging out in the graveyard, however, but we couldn't hang out at any of our homes. Whenever we wanted to drink or smoke weed, we could never do it in our homes. There was always someone who was there, who would catch us if we did. We also, as I mentioned, did not want to go to the graveyard. There were too many people who would be there, albeit in small and spread out groups, and since the graveyard had a reputation, it was a much more likely place for the police to come if they were going to try and bust some kids. Whenever we smoked pot, we would go to this bridge that was out of town. It was a bridge that was built for a train, so we never had to worry about cars driving by and someone catching us. Freight train operators wouldn't notice, wouldn't care if they did, and they wouldn't be able to stop if they did either. So we waited until the sun went down, of course, but it didn't really matter. We made our way over to the railroad track and followed it. We had been out to the bridge so often that even in the dark it wasn't difficult for us to know where we were going. We followed the railroad tracks, right out of the town, and into the more rural area surrounding the town. We eventually came to the creek that the bridge spanned. Once we got there, we had to climb down to get under the bridge. There was some concrete that was obviously used in support of the bridge that we always sat on while we smoked weed and talked. We knew that we hadn't been the first teenagers in history to have discovered that spot under the bridge. The walls of the small tunnel had graffiti on it that indicated others had known about it before we had. But up until then, we had never run into anyone else there, and as usual, there was no one there that time either. So we sat down and prepared to have a good time. We were down there for quite a while, having a pretty good Halloween. "Hey, what the hell is that?" one of my friends asked out of nowhere. Looking to see where he was pointing, we noticed something off in the distance. Someone was walking along the creek that the bridge was built over. "Just some guy," I recall responding to my friend, although we had never encountered anyone before walking along the creek. We kept watching as he got closer and closer, and when he ceased to be in a shadow in the distance, we were able to finally see what was coming toward us. "I don't freaking believe this," I said. It was a clown. Now, I didn't want to mention when the story happened before I began telling it. That's because it happened in 2016, when that whole weird clown sighting thing was going on. I didn't want it to seem obvious right away what the story was going to be about. All three of us watched scary stuff on YouTube, so by that time, we were all very familiar with the clown thing happening. This was in the middle of the height of what was going on. We had seen videos of ones that were obviously set up by people. But this was real, because we didn't take a video of it, and we hadn't set anything up to scare ourselves. And a lot of these sightings were in areas like the one we were in. Unlike many people who spotted clowns, we were not curious enough to spend much time trying to figure out what was going on. And if it had been anything except a clown, we would have chalked it up to a Halloween stunt. but we were not willing to risk it. The three of us climbed up back to the railroad tracks, and we started hustling along the tracks. We looked back after a while, and we were able to see that the figure had moved up from the creek to the tracks, but he was moving very slowly, so it didn't seem like he was trying to catch us. But we had no doubt that he was trying to scare us. I wish that we had been able to record this. At the time, everyone had a video of their clown encounter, and ours was just a story, so no one would read our story. But it's been a while, and I hope that you'll read it, Killer Orange Cat, because it was scary as hell to us.
Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.